groups in Alabama. Really good to have you with us, Professor. Can I start by asking you about the severity of these earthquakes? We know that the two major ones both exceeded magnitude 7. Explain to us what makes earthquakes so powerful.
Well, these are what is called structural fault zones. And structural fault zones like the North Anatolian Fault Zone and East Anatolian Fault Zone in Turkey and the San Andreas Fault in the United States are known to produce large earthquakes because their extent is very large, like San Andreas over 1,000 kilometers, North Anatolian Fault is 1,500 kilometers, it joins to East Anatolian Fault Zone and Erzincan-Karlova area and extend all the way to south and joins to East Anatolian Fault Zone. That's a huge fault system. When there is strain accumulation in a large part of the fault, then a large part of the fault gets broken, an earthquake happens, and that's why it is large. Like when we have earthquakes in Western Anatolia, those are not as big as the ones that are happening on the North Anatolian and East Anatolian fault zones. The Western Anatolia and Aegean earthquakes are, in general, less in magnitude than the earthquakes along North Anatolian and East Anatolian fault zones.
And Professor, despite the many technological advancements that have been made in terms of both monitoring and measuring seismic activity, we're still unable to predict the onset of earthquakes, are we? Why is it so difficult for us to be able to do that?
Because there is too many variables in the earth crust. And we talk about strain accumulation, and during the earthquake, in technical terms, we talk about release of stored elastic strain energy. But the earth crust is so heterogeneous, and it responds to stresses in many different ways at depth, then we can't really see when, or we cannot predict when the earthquake is going to happen. In my classes, I give this example. Like, for example, 100 years ago, people were saying, when we are in summer in Turkey or in the United States, people will say, oh, tomorrow is going to be nice weather. When in the winter, oh, there's a chance that it's going to be a bad weather and it may snow. But now, 100 years later, in 2020s, I can open up my iPhone and my iPhone can tell me precisely how the weather is going to be in 2 hours from now in Tuscaloosa and tomorrow morning. So that's the technological advances. In other words, in earthquake studies, we are really basically only like we were in weather prediction 100 years ago, no more than that. We're going to get there eventually, especially with my guess is that with the satellite technology, we are going to monitor the crustal behaviors, and also we're going to be imaging the Earth's crust at depth a lot better than what we are doing now. We have ways of doing those things, but not very precise yet. Eventually, we're going to happen. We're going to basically predict earthquakes. But when it's going to happen, it's too early to say. And maybe by the end of this century, maybe.
Okay, so it's just a matter of time. I'd like to ask you, Professor, I guess bearing in mind that we cannot predict when earthquakes will happen, but we've had two in rapid succession at around the same area in southeastern Turkey. Are we in the clear in terms of the onset of another large earthquake, another earthquake that surpasses a magnitude 7, or is that still too hard to say?
I'm going to answer it with our previous studies. Back in 1999, when there was that large Izmit earthquake in Turkey, I was in Turkey doing my sabbatical research at Ankara University. At one night, I was awakened with a large earthquake, and next day we went to earthquake arrays and did measurements. In that, there was two earthquake back to back, 7 seconds apart. But then, and this was in August 17, and then there was an earthquake later in September in Athens area in Greece. They were all related. And then in November 12th, there was that Kaynaşlı earthquake, which was triggered by the August 17 earthquake. We wrote all this in geological journals, and they've been well reviewed and well received. In other words, what I'm getting at, one thing we're sure that the basically what is called aftershocks are going to continue. Aftershocks are going to continue in the area within the next 2-3 days, maybe even a week or even up to a month, maybe a couple months even. But their density magnitude is going to get less and less, and eventually the crust is going to settle. Then the earthquake in those areas is not going to happen. But it doesn't mean that there's other faults in the area, for instance, along the Dead Sea fault zone to the south, or some of the faults in Mrs. Andren system, or to the north along the East Anatolian fault. It doesn't mean that there may not be an earthquake along those. In other words, we can tell where the earthquakes are going to happen, but we cannot tell when the earthquakes are going to happen. Unfortunately, not yet.
I see. Okay, Professor Ibrahim Çemen, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on TRT World. Appreciate it. Okay, let's return now to our defense correspondent, Ubay Shamanda, who